Hello, historians, and welcome back. We are still continuing to study the history of the United States since World War II, and it ended in 1945. Today we're going to be talking about the rise of the New Left in American politics, which arose in the 1960s and the 1970s in response to a lot of things that had happened during the Cold War. And so, over the next couple of lectures, I'm going to be talking about these new left and the new right. These are difficult concepts to talk about, though, because the new left is not really an organized group, just like the new right was not really an organized group, which we're going to talk about next time. There was a kind of resurrection of politics kind of on the left end of the political spectrum in the United States as a result of a whole bunch of different factors. The New Left movement was actually made up of a bunch of smaller scale movements, which most of them are listed right here. Civil rights movement, anti-nuclear movement, environmental movement, free speech, anti-war, counter. So I'm going to talk about each of these a little bit more detail, but the overall kind of all of these groups were basically fellow travelers with each other. They very, very rarely did the civil rights movement coordinate with, say, the environmental movement, or there was never, maybe they had different goals, maybe they had different tactics, but all of these various groups kind of made up what historians and political scientists have kind of called this umbrella label of the New Left. And that takes us back to the Cold War consensus that I talked about a week or two ago in a different lecture when I was talking about how the early Cold War had really narrowed the political spectrum in the United States. The fight against fascism in Europe during World War II had discredited the right end of the political spectrum, and the fight against communism during the Cold War discredited the left of the political spectrum in the United States. And so we were left with a very narrow political spectrum where we saw a lot more bipartisan consensus, we saw a lot more cooperation between various politicians, because there was a relatively narrow spectrum of views in the United States. There were still some people that called themselves liberal and some people that called themselves conservative, but relative to today, for example, liberal and conservatism, these were very moderate people compared to the, liberals and conservatives that exist today. And so we're going to talk a little bit about how this this narrow political spectrum in the United States expanded again in the wake of during the 1960s and the 1970s. Basically, today we're going to talk about kind of the expansion of politics into the new left. And so the left end of the political spectrum is going to suddenly kind of exist again. It's going to be resurrected. And so we're going to see a much larger scale, a much larger diversity of opinion in the United States political system veering to the left as a result of things like the anti-war movement, the environmental movement, civil rights movement, and all of that. And then we'll talk about the expansion on the right next time. But for now, I basically want to tell the story of how we got from the truncated system of this kind of golden age of the American political system where everybody got along and there was bipartisanship. How did that expand in the 1960s and the 1970s? And so to do that, we're going to look at a bunch of different groups of people and what they were doing to help expand that system. First, there's the civil rights movement. This was a movement on the left end of the political spectrum. There were certainly people on the right end of the political spectrum that applauded the civil rights movement because, the greater sense of freedom and all of that. But for the most part, this was a movement on the left end of the political spectrum. They were looking to completely reshape American culture and American society, which is not a very conservative goal. It's the opposite of conservative, which is why it tends to be kind of labeled on the left end of the political spectrum. And so you've got the civil rights movement, which we've talked about before. The civil rights movement, which kind of had two different strategies at play. The first is the nonviolent resistance strategy, which is favored by people like Martin Luther King. And then you've got the Black Power strategy, which is supported by people like Malcolm X. The nonviolent resistance process is a little bit of a misnomer, because nonviolent resistance, the point of nonviolent resistance is that you don't employ violence, but you want to elicit a violent response from the enemy, from the opposition. And so in the civil rights movement, you would have nonviolent protests where people would parade, they would sit down at lunch counters and all of that, and they would wait for a violent response from the powers that be. Whether that's the police dogs being sicked on kids at Birmingham in 1963, or white mobs attacking blacks at lunch counters in Greensboro or elsewhere. You want to have the violent response to your nonviolent activities, and you especially want it to get captured on tape. If you can get that with photos of the violent response to your nonviolent acts, that's going to look really, really good. And that's really going to build a lot of support for your movement. And that was the tack that Martin Luther King took. Nonviolent resistance, meaning we're not going to engage in any violent activity against the powers that be or against white people. However, we're going to inconvenience and anger white people to the point where they're going to respond violently. Black power is a bit more of a direct confrontation. Black power, Malcolm X didn't really have much time for the nonviolent tactics of people like Martin Luther King. That takes a long time. You're not guaranteed any kind of results. And so people like Malcolm X advocated for a much more forceful response. And so we've got this mix happening in the civil rights movement. But the overall goal of the civil rights movement is a recognition of black political autonomy, black citizenship, black equality. And so both of them are looking for that type of change to American culture. And so Martin Luther King's became the more popular of those tactics because, nonviolence in a civilized society is always better than violence, which is why Martin Luther King was able to command these massive crowds of people at the Washington Monument in 1963, where hundreds of thousands of people showed up to listen to him speak and other civil rights leaders speak. But at the same time, there was also some very effective strategies employed by the Black Power movement also. Black Power, though, was a bit scarier to potential white allies, and so the Black Power movement was much more alienating to the larger culture than the nonviolent system advocated by Martin Luther King was. So we've got the civil rights movement operating on one hand. On another hand, you've got a group of people that are starting to protest and get upset and concerned about the rise of the nuclear era. In the aftermath of the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, and then the development of more larger bombs like the hydrogen bomb, and then of course the Soviet Union getting their bombs, and eventually China getting bombs, and eventually proliferation happening around the world, a lot of people started to get concerned about that. Because these weapons, as we all know, in big enough numbers have the potential to completely wipe out the human race, destroy the planet, just wipe out all life on the planet. It can be a very dangerous development. And so we had the rise of groups that were dedicated to trying to rein in this nuclear proliferation. Groups like the Committee for a Sane Nuclear Policy, Women Striking for Peace, these were protest groups that were advocating for non-proliferation and hopefully the destruction of the existing nuclear stockpiles. Because again, the nuclear weapons are dangerous, and nuclear weapons threaten the future of humanity. They threaten the future of the world, and so there was this desire amongst these groups to try to stop the nuclear proliferation. So we get the slogans "better active today than radioactive tomorrow," and nuclear power is not healthy for children and other living things, which. Yeah, okay. Now this is the nuclear power being used for weapons. We've seen this image before. This is a chart showing the development of nuclear weapons in the United States arsenal and in the Soviet arsenal, the numbers of weapons that were developed over time. And so I don't need to spend much time talking about this, but needless to say, I mean, the big picture is that there are literally tens of thousands, it's in some years, I mean, we're getting to 60, 70,000 nuclear weapons scattered around the world if you take both sides into account. So there's a lot of nuclear weapons out there, and that from the perspective of the anti-nuclear movement, that presents a existential threat to humanity and to the entire planet. And like I said, when other countries start getting in on it, like in this case, we've got a Chinese hydrogen bomb, then it's just gives it that much more urgency, because the more countries that have nuclear weapons, in theory, the greater chance that one of them is eventually going to light one off in the wrong place at the wrong time, and that can lead to a cascading destruction around the world. So the anti-nuclear movement was dedicated to non-proliferation of nuclear weapons. They were also dedicated, though, to stopping peacetime or peaceful applications of nuclear technology. Nuclear power had come online in the 1950s and the 1960s. Nuclear reactors are very good at generating the steam that is required to spin dynamos to create electricity. And so nuclear power became kind of the potential new source of energy for the world in the 1960s and even into the 1970s. However, nuclear power has its risks. When you're employing nuclear reactors to generate the steam, there are there's always the possibility of that reactor going wrong, something going wrong. And in the United States, this happened in 1979 at the nuclear facility of 3 Mile Island in New York, when one of the nuclear reactors started to melt down, and that caused a panic, because if a nuclear reactor melts down, that's going to release a whole lot of radiation out into the atmosphere, along with potential explosions, and that could be very, very dangerous. Radiation is the silent but deadly killer, and so everybody was scared that if this melted down, then that could lead to widespread environmental catastrophe. A more dramatic example of nuclear power going awry happened at the Chernobyl nuclear plant in the Ukraine, in what was then the Soviet Union, when one of the reactors completely melted down and exploded and spewed radiation into a massive cloud that spread across a big chunk of Asia and part of Europe. Luckily, most of it dispersed without too harmful side effects, but this region of the Ukraine where the Chernobyl nuclear plant existed, still the wreckage is still there today, and that entire area is going to be uninhabitable for something like 1,000 years because of all the radiation that was let loose. And so the anti-nuclear crowd basically was able to point to these as demonstrations of the problems with nuclear power. And the anti-nuclear group kind of overlapped with the environmental movement that was developing in the 1960s and the 1970s. But there, again, the anti-nuclear, they were focused strictly on nuclear issues, nuclear annihilation and or nuclear mishaps in the power stations. The environmental movement was much more broadly focused on just all general threats to the American environment. And there were a bunch of notable events in the 1960s and the 1970s that prompted the development of an activist group that was dedicated to trying to rein in pollution and other threats to the natural environment. One of those kind of dramatic moments was when the river in Cleveland caught on fire. Because it was so heavily polluted, and eventually there was a spark, and the chemicals within the river caught fire, and so the river was burning. And so this joke is one of the things that people kind of joked about at the time. There was a hotel chain that used to say, "We'll keep the light on for you." That was their catchphrase. In this case, "We'll keep the river on for you." The river was burning. And that's a problem. You don't want rivers to catch on fire, because, water's not supposed to catch on fire, but only if it's so pumped full of pollutants can it actually catch fire. Now, going back throughout most of American history, smoke demonstrated progress. If you look back at the Gilded Age and the Progressive Era, there's always kind of this glamorization of the new factories that were being built, and all these factories belched out all kinds of smoke and nasty pollutants into the air, but that smoke represented progress to everybody, because that meant that factory was operating. That factory was building things that were sent out to the world for consumption. Those factories were employing workers to build those things. And so smoke was a good sign. It was a sign of a productive economy. It was a sign of a healthy factory. And so smoke was actually kind of cheered in the United States. Especially during the 19th century and even into the 20th century, smoke was kind of held up as a sign of progress. And so this is a shot. That last one was the Duquesne steel factories. Excuse me, this one's in Pittsburgh. There was, even as late as the 1960s, there was a sense that smoke and the ability to consume resources was such a good thing that the Humble Oil Company in 1962, which is now part of Exxon, I believe, the Humble Oil Company put this 2-page advertisement in newspapers saying that each day Humble supplies enough energy to melt 7 million tons of glacier. Now, this type of ad isn't going to be welcome today because we recognize today that that's actually not a good thing when the glaciers melt. But again, back in the first half of the 20th century, even as late as 1962, there was a sense that this was a good thing. The ability to create enough energy that would melt glaciers is kind of an amazing thing. And again, it's something to be liked, something to be cheered. And so, but that all starts to change. I mean, another thing that was cheered for a long time was the suburban sprawl, because as people kind of spread out, as cities spread out, there was the idea that everybody should have their own plot of land. They should get out of those big crowded apartment buildings in the central cities. And so we start to see this development of sprawl in cities across the country. Some of the most famous examples of sprawl were in Southern California, around the Los Angeles area, but pretty much every city in the country now has some version of sprawl. And sprawl was seen as a good thing. It was because it was freedom. Everybody was able, even in cities, everybody was able to own, theoretically. They were able to own or at least rent their own plot of land. They were able to have a home, a separate detached house. They were able to get away from the unclean, dirty apartment buildings of the downtown areas. And so this expansion was a good thing. And so this was accompanied by the expansion of freeway systems in the 1950s. Eisenhower created or helped to put into place the interstate highway system, which facilitated a lot of that sprawl because people could now move out. They could follow the highways out into the hinterlands, and so they could start expanding into new areas of, surrounding urban areas. But eventually, of course, that in order for people to function in a system like that, the preferred method of transportation became the automobile. And eventually, as more and more people start to live in the suburbs, but if they work in the central city area, that means commutes. That means a lot of cars coming and going on these highway systems. And so you end up like this. This is on the I-405 in Los Angeles near, Washington, near Venice, but this is, I'm drawing a blank on the neighborhood this is. But anyway, this is what happens, of course, is you've got traffic jams that come with the sprawl. And all these cars coming and going into the cities creates a whole new environmental problem, which is, of course, smog. The first kind of known and recognized epidemic example of smog came in Donora, Pennsylvania in 1948. When the smog, which is which as a word is supposed to be a combination of smoke and fog, but it's not really either of them. Smog is the accumulation of pollutants from the automobile exhaust that are collecting in the air over cities. So Donora was one of the first kind of known outbreaks of smog on a large scale, but of course Southern California also became one of the best known areas that attracted smog. And the way that happened, in Los Angeles' case anyway, is that Los Angeles is on the one side you've got the ocean. On the other three sides you have mountain ranges, which kind of trap the air. And so what tends to happen is high pressure forms over the Los Angeles Basin, as it's called. And so you've got hills on three sides on the ocean. You've got a high pressure system, which basically forms a lid on top of that bowl in which Los Angeles exists. And so the city then basically cooks in that bowl. The cars come in and they shoot out exhaust. The exhaust basically just sits in this bowl and eventually accumulates and accumulates and accumulates to the point where the city becomes inundated with smog and car pollutants. And a lot of Los Angelinos kind of took it in stride and tried to, be kind of lighthearted about it. So you'd have people that are selling balloons of clean desert air. You've got other jokesters that are selling cans of genuine Los Angeles smog. But the reality, of course, is that for the average person, this can cause some obvious health problems as people have to breathe this stuff and see in this stuff. I mean, even this guy that's selling the balloons of clean desert air, he's wearing a gas mask. The Los Angeles became in some ways you couldn't even see the city even if you were within the city because the smog was so thick. So again, we've got images of people wearing gas masks and all of that. This is a little bit later, 1979. But the smog epidemic became a concern for people that are, environmentally minded, because this is destroying the natural environment. This is man-made pollution being forced down the throats of everybody, even people that didn't make that pollution. So the environmental movement was partially in response to the accumulation of smog in cities. It was also the response to other forms of corporate pollution that developed in the 1960s. In 1969, we had one of the first public oil spills off the coast of Santa Barbara in Southern California. The Santa Barbara is one of the most beautiful stretches of coastline in the world, and right off the coast of it, there was an oil rig where the pipe broke and millions of gallons of oil came busting loose and polluted the ocean along that Santa Barbara coastline. And so this map up here is showing basically the spread of the oil kind of down current from the oil rig, spoiling all the beaches along the Los Angeles coastline from Santa Barbara all the way down to Ventura and even farther on as the oil slick spread. The oil slick, of course, resulted in unknown numbers of dead animals, dead birds, dead fish, dead sea life, and various other animals that ate those creatures. And there was a massive cleanup effort where volunteers would try to clean up the beaches, try to clean up the oil, with some varying levels of success. But the example or the existence of the oil became offensive to a lot of people in Southern California. And so this is also going to help fuel the rise of an environmental movement in the late 1960s, early 1970s. And then there's just your everyday kind of corporate pollution that tends to happen, corporate and agricultural pollution. There were, up until the 1960s, there were few regulations on where people could dump their waste. And so a lot of chemicals and a lot of sewage were just dumped into rivers, dumped into lakes and the ocean, basically without any kind of filter, without any kind of cleanup system. They were just dumped raw chemicals, raw sewage into the water. And this started to prompt a lot of people to start thinking about how nature operates. What's going to happen if we start dumping and introducing all of this stuff into nature that didn't exist before and probably should not exist there? And so a new movement developed, an environmental movement, and some of the big names of the environmental movement started to kind of come up with general ideas for how do we respond, what should humanity do, and how can we make the world a cleaner place again. And so this Barry Commoner, in a famous book on the environmental that became kind of one of the big books of the environmental movement called The Closing Circle, created these maxims of ecology, which is that everything is connected to everything else. Everything must go somewhere. Nature knows best, and there's no such thing as a free lunch, which means that any pollution that we introduce into the environment, it doesn't just disappear, as a lot of people maybe thought it did before. It stays there, and it accumulates, and the effects get worse and worse and worse over time. And so we have a whole new movement of environmentalists. We have a new academic field that comes into existence called based on ecology. The study of ecology didn't exist until the 1960s, 1970s, which was basically an attempt to scientifically understand the way nature operates and the way nature is altered when you introduce chemicals and pollution into that environment, into that ecosystem. So we start to see the development of words like that, concepts like that. One of the other big names in this kind of new environmental movement is Rachel Carson, who was and still is a controversial figure when it comes to environmental politics. She wrote a book called Silent Spring in 1962, where she made the argument that all the pesticides that were being used in agriculture were actually harmful. There had been attempts by chemical industries to say that all the pesticides like DDT and all of that were not harmful to humanity. However, by the late 50s, early 1960s, there was a lot of research that was indicating that chemicals like DDT and other pesticides were actually contributing to cancer in humanity, because they were finding that, farmers would spray DDT on their crops to prevent mosquitoes and other bugs from eating the crops. But then the DDT would get into the soil and it would get into the plant. And then when humans consumed the plant, it would end up in the human body. And so they started to find examples of DDT in the human body. And they started to find that DDT in the human body started to cause cancer. And so Silent Spring was a book where she basically laid all of this out. It's a very scientific book, where she kind of presents the scientific argument that says that pesticides like DDT are bad for the environment and they're bad for humanity. And this caused a whole lot of grief for the chemical industry. The chemical industry launched a campaign, which in some ways is still in operation today, to try to discredit Silent Spring and try to discredit Rachel Carson by proclaiming that no, these things are safe. Even though from a scientific perspective, there hasn't really been much of a scientific rebuttal to Rachel Carson and the book that she wrote. In 1968, Garrett Hardin was a philosopher who kind of summed up the environmental problem in an essay that he called The Tragedy of the Commons. And Tragedy of the Commons is a phenomenon where he used the example of a field. And in the field, if you put one cow into the field, the cow will start eating grass, the cow will eat a lot of the plants, but one cow isn't going to do a whole lot of damage to that field. And so what happens is, if you're the owner of that cow, it becomes in your interest to send your cow to that field because you want your cow to eat. The problem comes when every other farmer, every other cow owner in the area decides the same thing. Because individually, it makes a lot of sense to send your cow to that field. However, the problem is that if everybody sends their cow to that field, then you've got a tragedy because the entire field is going to be destroyed and nobody will be able to send their cows there anymore. So another way to think of it is like a car. One car, the pollution or the exhaust from one car isn't going to make any difference to the global ecology, the global atmosphere, the global environment. However, if you've put, 10 billion cars and they're all start spewing their own chemicals and their own exhaust, then you've got a problem. And so Garrett Hardin kind of put this philosophy, wrote this essay to kind of try to give everybody kind of a common understanding of what the problem is when it comes to the use of environmental resources. Because if one person does it, okay, no problem, that's not going to make much of a difference. If everybody does it, then that's going to create a huge problem. And then kind of one of the other things that kind of finally contributed to the rise of environmental movement was NASA, ironically. When you send astronauts to the moon, they came back with these amazing photos of Earth. And this is one of the more famous of those photos, where you've got the Earthrise, where Earth rising over the horizon on the moon. And what this showed everybody is that, wow, we live on a pretty small chunk of rock floating around in the universe, and this is the only chunk of rock that we can live on. And so we probably need to do better at protecting this rock. Because if we don't, then that's going to lead to, again, the destruction of humanity. And you get back to that whole anti-nuclear thing again. So this really helped to prompt the development of an environmental movement also. So you've got all those strands coming together under the kind of umbrella group of environmentalism. Now, those groups are all activist groups. They're pressure groups. They are intended to, hopefully enact legislation and all of that. But there was also a political arm of all of this new agitation on the left end of the political spectrum. The Students for a Democratic Society became kind of the political leaders of this new sense of activism and this new kind of resurrection of politics on the left. The Students for a Democratic Society was largely established by college students. They got together in 1962 and crafted a statement where they tried to kind of summarize what their generation was thinking about issues like the environment, race. And so this Port Huron statement started with a preamble to it, was that we are people of this generation, bred in at least modest comfort, housed now in universities, looking uncomfortably to the world we inherit. When we were kids, the United States was the wealthiest and strongest country in the world, the only one with the atom bomb, the least scarred by modern war, an initiator of the United Nations that we thought would distribute Western influence throughout the world, freedom and equality for each individual, government of, by, and for the people. These American values we found good principles by which we could live as men. Many of us began maturing in complacency. As we grew, however, our comfort was penetrated by events too troubling to dismiss. First, the permeating and victimizing fact of human degradation, symbolized by the Southern struggle against racial bigotry, compelled most of us from silence to activism. Second, the enclosing fact of the Cold War, symbolized by the presence of the bomb, brought awareness that we ourselves and our friends and millions of abstract others we knew more directly because of our common peril might die at any time. We might deliberately ignore or avoid or fail to feel all other human problems, but not these two, for these two are too immediate and crushing in their impact, too challenging in the demand that we as individuals take the responsibility for encounter and resolution. So what they're saying is that we are comfortable here in the United States. We grew up in a very comfortable time. However, there were these crushing problems that we had been kind of sweeping under the rug for far too long. Civil rights and nuclear proliferation. As time goes on, this is 1962, when you get into the late 60s, the people that are kind of following this new left kind of vision of politics are also going to start embracing the things like the environmental movement and all of that. But there's this sense that there are some huge problems in the United States that we want to resolve. And the way that they're going to resolve it is going to take many forms. We've already talked about anti-nuclear, we've talked about civil rights, we've talked about environmentalism. There was also kind of a student movement that came out of the Students for a Democratic Society. That was, again, a group of college students. Now, the SDS, that organization kind of flamed out fairly quickly because everybody had different ideas of how we should fix the world. But there was student movements across the country. This is at UC Berkeley in California. There was what became known as the free speech movement, where people would get up and stand in front of large crowds and rail against the status quo. This prompted a whole lot of agitation by university officials, led to some universities getting shut down. This led to some students occupying university administration buildings. The college campuses became radicalized during this period in pursuit of, because of the civil rights movement, environmentalism, and all of that. Well, not entirely, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But the other big galvanizing movement within this new left umbrella term was the anti-war movement. Now, in my last lecture, I talked all about Vietnam, and I talked a little bit about some of the effects happening back home, but I didn't spend very much time on it. But things like the Tet Offensive, the My Lai massacre, the collapse or the kind of disintegration of the American armed forces in the early 1970s, all of that stuff filtered back home to the U.S. And sparked a massive anti-war movement, the likes of which we haven't really seen since. Now, a lot of the anti-war movement was fueled by the unfairness of the draft. Was a huge problem here. Over here on the left, you've got the lottery for choosing draftees. On the right, you've got people protesting the draft. So there's the unfairness of forcing people to go overseas to fight this war that a lot of people thought was unjust, that a lot of people thought was pointless, and that a lot of people thought was immoral. We talked last time about the My Lai massacre and all of that, and how the perception back home was that this war is corrupting our boys, that they're corrupting Americans. American teenagers and kids in their early 20s and their teens should not be bloodthirsty monsters that line people up and shoot them with machine guns. However, that's what they're doing at My Lai. And so there's something wrong if this war is creating that type of an environment. And so there are people upset with the draft, but there's also a lot of soldiers that came back from the war that protested that protested the war once they got back home. There was a huge participation among veterans who fought for who protested the war in Vietnam. And so we start to see a lot of sites where people are publicly protesting. In this case, you've got people burning their draft cards in New York. We've got protests. People start coming together in large protests in various cities across the country to try to demonstrate their anger with the conduct of the war, but also just the existence of the war in the first place. We've got protests in San Francisco and in Washington D.C. in April of 1965. Remember, if you remember from my the discussion of Vietnam last time, the first ground forces entered, got off the boat in Da Nang in March of 1965. This is, 6 weeks later. We've got protests happening at home in the United States. The anti-war movement was there from the very beginning, and it's only going to get bigger over time as returning veterans start to swell the ranks of the anti-war movement. As more and more draftees get sent overseas, the families of a lot of those draftees are going to get mobilized and radicalized and enter into the anti-war movement also. And so the crowds at these anti-war protests are going to get larger and larger as the war goes on. We talked a little bit before about the links between the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement. These were very strong links. The civil rights movement abhorred Vietnam largely because there was a perception that the majority of soldiers being sent to fight overseas were poor, because there were a bunch of exemptions for the draft. Things like if you were a college student, you could defer the draft. And so what that means is that a lot of the more wealthy Americans who could afford to go to college were able to avoid being drafted and sent to Vietnam, but the people that could not afford to avoid the draft had to go to Vietnam. And so that responsibility fell a lot more on minority groups than it did on white men, for example. And so the civil rights movement, one of their goals was to fight against the Vietnam War. And so in this case, we've got people like Muhammad Ali saying that he's got no quarrel with the Viet Cong. There's a sense that the Vietnamese never did anything to the United States, and they especially never did anything to black people. And so why should black people be sent to go fight that war overseas? And the anti-war plank or the anti-war goal in the civil rights movement unified almost all those branches of the civil rights movement that I was talking about. I mean, Muhammad Ali, you've got Martin Luther King, you've got Malcolm X. All of these people were noted opponents of the Vietnam War. Martin Luther King gave a speech in 1967 on his opposition to the war in Vietnam. Um, there was just and the anti-war protests in some cases took on kind of a theatrical aspect, because as these things get bigger and bigger and more popular, there's always kind of pranksters that get involved here. And so in this case, we've got kind of this pair kind of making a statement about, the U.S. and its relationship with the South Vietnamese government based in Saigon. But it also starts to get bigger as time goes on. In 1967, there was a huge protest in Washington, D.C., by the Lincoln Memorial, and eventually a bunch of those protesters decided to head across the river and march on the Pentagon, which is, the headquarters of the American military. And so on October 21st of 1967, the Pentagon got surrounded by anti-war protesters, thousands of them surrounding the Pentagon. And we had this kind of, in some ways, ridiculous situation where you've got unarmed protesters facing off against very heavily armed military personnel surrounding the Pentagon. And then the anti-war protesters, the pranksters in the crowd, start calling for the anti-war protesters to use their minds, and collectively we can levitate the Pentagon. And so these thousands of protesters, who kind of all got in on the joke, they never really seriously believed it could happen, but they all started acting like they were going to use their minds to levitate the Pentagon. And this really started to freak out the military personnel that were surrounding the Pentagon, because you've got thousands of people making weird motions and making weird noises, trying to kind of pretend like they were going to levitate the Pentagon. And then you've got images like this, where protesters handing flowers over to the military personnel. This made for a very weird, awkward, tense moment, and unfortunately it eventually erupted into violence. Again, non-violent protest eliciting a violent response. You've got unarmed protesters who are handing flowers to the military personnel, and the military responds with beatings. So this is another one of those examples of nonviolent resistance that I was talking about. But what was otherwise a civil rights strategy was being adopted by this anti-war movement also. In 1968, one of the more famous kind of chaotic moments of the anti-war period came at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. The Democratic Party, that was the party of Kennedy, the party of Johnson. The Democrats had been in charge during the expansion of the war in Vietnam. And so the protesters took their protest to the Democratic National Convention to try to demonstrate their anger with this war, because they saw it as a Democrats' war. And so on the one hand, this turned into another scene of violence. The police chief in Chicago and the mayor, Richard Daley, made a solemn promise that there would be no protests in his city. And when protests showed up in the city, he unleashed the police force to exert maximum force to try to dispel the protests. There was another element of street theater in all of this, when a bunch of protesters decided to hold their own convention for nominating a president. And they nominated Pegasus, this pig, as their presidential candidate. And then eventually the cops busted up this mini convention, and eventually arrested a lot of those, I don't know if you want to call them pranksters, but these guys that are trying to make a point about their dissatisfaction with the Democratic Party. Anyway, they arrested them. They also arrested Pegasus and took him away from the people that owned him. So Pegasus, the candidacy of Pegasus ended pretty quickly, but it's there, and it should be more generally recognized in the history books. So the convention in Chicago is another example of the turmoil that's kind of engulfing the country. Again, the crowds are getting bigger and bigger and bigger. On October 15th of 69, the year after the Democratic National Convention, there was a coordination of mass protests in Washington, D.C. and San Francisco, where somewhere on the order of 1 million people turned out, making this probably the biggest of the anti-war protests to date. The protests are going to get bloody in 1970 at what became known as the Kent State Massacre, where Kent State University in northern Ohio there was an anti-war protest happening, and the governor of Ohio swore that there would be no more protests on university campuses. And so he sent in the National Guard to quell the uprising. And unfortunately, that tense moment eventually erupted in gunfire, and four students from Kent State died as a result of that violence. And so this is going to provide these four dead college students, of course, are going to become martyrs to the anti-war movement. And this is going to reflect very, very poorly on the National Guard and on the governor that had sent them in. And so Kent State became kind of a rallying cry for the anti-war movement for the rest of the war, because the authorities, the powers that be, have demonstrated just how dangerous they are in a situation like this. My alma mater, Ohio State University in Columbus, had its own series of protests in April and May of 1970, where the university was shut down for 6 weeks while the protesters threw rocks at police officers and at National Guard troops. Again, this is the same governor that sent the troops in Kent State, also sent them to Ohio State. And so for 6 weeks, there was this ongoing protest on the campus of Ohio State. These are students on Ohio State that are protesting the ROTC class of that year of 1970. So this is happening in universities everywhere. These two examples happen to be in Ohio because I'm in Ohio, but there are instances like this happening on university campuses across the country. This is in Seattle, where protesters shut down highways. And again, this is causing a huge inconvenience when you shut down highways, but that's the point. The inconvenience is the point, because if you don't inconvenience people, they may not notice the problem. And so what happens here with these protesters, their goal is to inconvenience people who are not already involved, so that those people can become aware of what's happening and hopefully join your side. You also run the risk of, angering those people and turning them off, but still, you want to send a message by creating a mass protest, which inconveniences a lot of people. As I mentioned before, soldiers returning from the Vietnam War also contributed to the anti-war sentiment, anti-war movements. In 1971, Congress became interested in the account of returning soldiers who came back with horrific stories about war crimes being committed by other American soldiers. And one of the more famous manifestations of that was what became known as this Winter Soldier investigation, where Vietnam Veterans Against the War interviewed returning veterans and collected all of their stories about what American soldiers did over there in Vietnam. The My Lai massacre had been on the front pages for 2 years at this point, and so it wasn't hard to believe that there was other nasty stuff happening also. And so the military, the returning veterans, told their stories about what they encountered, and eventually some of them even reported to Congress. John Kerry was a lieutenant who came to Congress to talk about the various things that he saw veterans doing, or American soldiers doing in Vietnam, which again ignites the whole discussion again about what is this war, how horrific is this war that it is turning our kids into such nasty killing machines and nasty murderers and all of that. And so the Vietnam Veterans Against the War was another constituency group of the anti-war movement. And then we've got, more rounds of protests. I'm talking about the May Day protests in May of 1971, mainly because you've got this picture over here on the left, which looks like a movie poster of this couple, while there's absolute chaos breaking out around them. But this is a legit picture from the protests in May. And again, you've got peaceful protesters being attacked by police, so again, the nonviolent system is working for the protesters here also. And so in the wake of the Tet Offensive and in the wake of discoveries about My Lai, popular support for the war back home in the United States plummeted dramatically, which I touched on a little bit last time when I was talking about Vietnam. So overall, all of this stuff is contributing to what I'm talking about, this new left in American politics. Now, as I mentioned before, there's no unified agenda for the new left. It's just a lot of different groups coming together that have similar goals: ending the war in Vietnam, enacting environmental legislation, stuff like that. But they're not all working together. It's more of just a general movement on the left end of the political spectrum, where the goal is to upset and possibly overturn the status quo. And so the strategies that they would pursue, speaking truth to power, you've got the old authorities that are entrenched in power, and so we need to stand up to them and tell them what they're doing is wrong. Tell them that we need to do something differently. Remind those powers that be that the world is watching what they do. And when they do bad things, there's going to be protest, there's going to be rebellion, there's going to be insurrection. And of course, nonviolent resistance became a common tactic used by all of these new left organizations because it is a very effective way to go. If you can be nonviolent but elicit a violent response, then you've succeeded, especially if it's caught on tape, because that gets shown to the world and a lot of the people will come to your side. All right, and the kind of the lasting result of all of this agitation kind of on the new left was a new conception of personal rights. Now, there had always been the sense of rights for Americans going all the way back to the Bill of Rights, the U.S. Constitution, and all of that. But there's a sense that in addition to all those political rights, there are also personal rights that everybody is entitled to. And we haven't talked about all of the movements that brought about all of these new conceptions, but in general, this is a list of what people on the left end of the political spectrum believed were rights. The right not to be segregated based on skin color. The right to vote and be represented by someone like you. Those two are straight out of the civil rights movement. The right to walk down the street unmolested without fear of violence, meaning we want to shut down police brutality, which was another kind of factor that the civil rights movement was fighting against. You have the right to protest without being labeled as a subversive. You have right to equal access to education, housing, and jobs. In some ways, this was recognized at the federal level. LBJ's Great Society was dedicated to that particular right. You have the right to live in clean, healthy communities. That's the environmental movement. You have the right to love whom you want and how you want. We'll talk a little bit next time about the gay rights movement and interracial marriage movement. We'll talk a little bit about that next time. You have the right to be left alone, the right to privacy, and the right to control over your own body. This one is a new development. It's one that is certainly in the news today when you talk about things like abortion rights and all of that. We'll talk a little bit more about that next time also. But so basically, the big picture, though, is that the lasting contribution of all this new activity on the left end of the political spectrum is a new conception of what it means to be an American. What rights do you have? In the past, older generations had talked about inalienable rights granted by God and all of that. The new left wants to add these rights to that list. The old rights of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. In addition to that the happiness, liberty, and all of that also includes these things here. And so this is what the new left wanted to see. And so I've been talking all along about how that Cold War consensus was breaking down on the left end of the political spectrum. When we come back next time, we're going to talk about the response to that, because we're also going to see that breaking down on the right end of the political spectrum, there's going to be a backlash against all of this agitation on the left end of the spectrum. We're going to see counter protests against the anti-war movement. USA, love it or leave it. You have people calling for victory in Vietnam rather than just withdrawing U.S. troops. There's going to be counter protests to all of those new left movements. Don't trust the red murderers. Be an American. Fight communism in the USA. Because if you've got people agitating and they're calling themselves leftists, we're still in a Cold War here, and so it's not too difficult to start attaching labels like communists and all of that to those people on the left end of the spectrum. we've got, this one's talking about draft dodgers and pinkos and cowards. And so we'll talk about a little bit more about this backlash against all those new rights movements next time. And sometimes it gets violent there also. We've got a violent protest. This one is actually construction workers who were supporting the war in Vietnam versus police. So it's a very mixed up world that existed at that point. But not all hope is lost from the New Left perspective. On Inauguration Day in 1969, when Richard Nixon took the oath of office, the wife of Pegasus was spotted out on the lawn next to the Washington Monument, which demonstrated that the New Left, of course, isn't going anywhere. So we'll come back next time, talk about the rise of the New Right, and let me know if you have any questions or concerns, and I will talk to you again soon. Take care.